this talk is kind of it's partly rooted in the philosophy of science, but it links to some other topics as well, some of which are a bit further from my core areas. But I'll be taking a look at the question of the justification of induction and suggesting that there are various interesting historical links to some things that you might not have anticipated. I like the way this talk and the one before it and those after it all seem to have very similar themes, even maybe within the conference, where of course already there's a great deal of mutually interesting things. Okay, so I'll talk about the problem of induction, and then I'll look at some examples, and then I'll take a look a bit at the Stoics, and then if there's time, I will consider some objections. Okay, so science is supposed to be empirical and opposed to a priori knowledge claims. Think of David Hume's strict empiricism. Think of the problem of induction, though there are roots in Sextus Empiricus. After all, we haven't experienced tomorrow. There's no guarantee that bread will stay nourishing or the sun will rise. The course of nature might change. All events are loose and separate. Anything can follow anything. And this isn't impossible or even improbable, according to the logical empiricists when they're wrestling with induction. And so, according to Hume, our expected uniformity is a habit which we can recover by playing backgammon if necessary. We give up philosophy. So the consequences of not solving the problem of induction might be quite striking. According to Reichenbach, Wesley Salmon, and in our own day, Gerhard Schurz, who considers himself a logical empiricist, science would be no better than fortune-telling or religion, which was intended, in this audience, I should point out, that was intended as a significant criticism. Maybe not everyone here would agree. But anyway, I suggest that science is relying on exceptionless uniformity and rejection of contrary testimony, especially relating to history, might be especially vulnerable on this point. One might also think, as C.D. Broad has pointed out, and in the 18th century, the Abbé Bergier suggested, Hume's critique of miracles may be blunted by his critique of induction. And indeed, there is a long-standing theme in philosophy, I think rarely dominant, but often present, that skepticism could be a sort of warm-up exercise for faith. And you might find that arguably in St. Paul, Tertullian, al-Ghazali, Montaigne, and all these other people, many of whom are Christians, but one, al-Ghazali, was an extremely successful Islamic apologist. A couple are Jewish, including Richard Popkin, the great historian of philosophy, but he also identifies himself with the theme of skepticism as making room for faith. Quite apart from that, in the 20th century, solving Hume's problem of induction was a major thread of 20th century philosophy, which I think one can safely say ended in exhaustive failure for the most part. A few people kept working on it, but there wasn't too much outside a few pockets, say from the 1980s till recently. So we seem to be left with basically Bayes' theorem and your opinions, according to Cohen-Hausen, which has kind of a relativistic feel. Now, the logical empiricist tradition was both very strong in trying to deal with this issue and a place where you might say it has persisted or been revived. Feigl, Reichenbach, Salmon, Clendenin, and in our own day, Gerhard Schurz, who was very lively and prolific. So Salmon and Schurz aim to defend science against relativism and what Schurz calls esoteric worldviews, things like fortune-telling, creationism, orthodox Abrahamic religions, and the like. So he thinks if he justifies induction, then one will have good reason not to believe in those things. Now, the justification is pragmatic. This is Reichenbach's pragmatic justification of induction. Pragmatic in the sense that it does not aim to show that inductive predictions will work, will come true, or even probably will come true, those being excessively ambitious goals which you just can't achieve, they say. So maybe induction will not work for predicting the future, but if anything will work for predicting the future, then induction will work, and therefore induction is a wise bet, perhaps the best alternative. That's roughly how the argument goes, except that it's not object level of induction like bread remaining nourishing or the uniformity of nature. It's actually a higher level a higher level induction, a meta-induction. You might look at track records of weather forecasters, electricians, fortune tellers, prophets, whatever. Various ways of making predictions. Now, there is an underappreciated, potentially controversial claim, I suggest, and that is the claim that science or the uniformity of nature has, in fact, worked best so far. Now, that might seem kind of obvious, but the question is not science versus fortune telling or science versus prophecy, the like. It is science better than science qualified by a few esoteric exceptions. So it's science versus something that is almost science, but slightly different once in a while. But if you're prepared to grant that, then it seems that we do have a pretty good argument that scientific prediction is the best bet for future prediction. And this conclusion is strong enough to matter and be interesting, but weak enough to be defensible. And that's a sweet spot that's fairly difficult to hit in the justification of induction, I think. Okay, so why should we engage in meta-induction? After all, if we're open in principle to ideas like fortune telling, as Reichenbach and Salmon and Schurz insist that we should be, to be good empiricists, why not just fortune telling all the way down? Consult your fortune teller, ask the crystal ball, are crystal balls reliable? And if the crystal ball says yes, then you're good to go. Well, no, and Hans Reichenbach explained why in 1938 in Experience and Prediction. The clairvoyant might be an imposter. That's the reason why we could not admit clairvoyance without control. We demand the forecast of the clairvoyant and compare it with later observations. If then there is a good correspondence between the forecast and the observations, we shall infer by induction that the man's prophecies will also be true in the future. In other words, lots of people have claimed to be prophets, an awful lot of them were not actually prophets, according to their track record. So that is one reason. Notice, however, that Reichenbach admits that in principle, meta-induction could justify this sort of behavior. He doesn't think that it does, but he also makes no effort to show it. I think he doesn't really take it as a serious, possibility. Okay, so recall, the aim is to justify induction to the extent that one can without begging the question, postulating, stipulating, or any of those things. Postulating being something that more Kantian inclined authors like Arthur Burke suggested in the same debate. And as a result, Schurz tells us fortune tellers, scripture readers, and so on ought to be persuaded to renounce their practices in favor of science. Now, he doesn't predict whether they will, but he says they should be. And furthermore, he claims that this was actually not shown until recently, which is a striking claim. Anyway, one thing he does not do in this, I think, rather mature paper in 2008 is seriously worry that people in favor of fortune telling or scripture reading or the like might themselves invoke meta-induction or perhaps even had already done so. That's a worry that's only addressed seemingly out of nowhere in an ad hoc way in his book in 2019. And I confess I had a hand in that process by private channels. So anyway, there's this historical issue potentially at stake regarding short-run disagreements, and this is something that you already find in Reichenbach and in Wes Salmon, who was once described as waging a one-man war on this topic. So there's this problem in that there are ways of making predictions that agree eventually with induction, but may disagree for a while. And as Wesley Salmon points out, the short run is what really concerns us. Or here's Michael Friedman. We have no idea, we know that the scientific method will produce truth at some point, but we have no idea where the happy point, the point of convergence occurs. And two, we have no idea what the connection between scientific method and truth is before the point of convergence. Before the point of convergence, our hypotheses may be arbitrarily far from the truth. So to give a lively example, maybe the best way, for all that Reichenbach has shown, the best way to design airplanes for the next 1,000 years will be by consulting fortune tellers. And then finally, in 1,000 years, science will kick in, and the Navier-Stokes equations and wind tunnels and computers and all those things will be the best way to design airplanes. But for now, and for the next 1,000 years, maybe it's crystal balls. That's not something that Reichenbach can rule out. And so it would seem that there is room, as far as Reichenbach has shown, for esoteric prediction to outperform science if the esotericist rarely disagrees with science. Or even, does so for the next 1,000, well, that wouldn't really work. Anyway, the point is localized disagreement is something that was difficult for Reichenbach to exclude. Now, Schurz has made considerable progress on that front. But notice in the philosophy literature on induction, there's a remarkable lack of realism in that no real person has ever thought that induction usually fails. Someone who believes in prophecy or fortune telling or anything like that thinks that presumably these things only, they're only working part of the time, and presumably they have worked pretty well on those occasions where they're actually turned on, but usually they're, so to speak, turned off. So either they don't conflict with science or they don't say anything at all most of the time. And there's now finally a terminology for this. You could call such players intermittent, according to Schurz and Thorne. So consider Jewish and Christian gynecologists do not take Sarah's bearing Isaac after menopause or the Virgin Mary's bearing Jesus as precedents. They don't think this is just something that happens from time to time. So, hey, maybe it happened in Los Angeles a few years ago. No, these are supposed to be unique, non-repeatable events for special theological reasons. So the difference is between induction with a few esoteric exceptions and induction without qualification, and that fits well within the recognized short-run worries. Unlike, say, randomly predicting or predicting counter-inductively, such as you would find in the philosophy literature on induction. Okay, now an example. Unfortunately, I didn't start my stopwatch, but anyway, a first example would be Abraham and his journey, which turns out to be from induction to meta-induction, I claim. Now, the story may be familiar, but you've probably not thought about it in light of logical positivism very often. So that's the sort of commentary I will give here. So Abraham and Sarah early on were following the science, to recall a phrase that at least in America once said about COVID not too long ago. So God promised Abram, as he was known, lots of descendants, but for a really long time, he and his wife were getting old and no child came. Eventually, they got a change of name. Anyway, they followed the science. They used inductive gynecology, such as they had 4,000 odd years ago, we're told. And the solution was Sarah's maidservant Hagar, who became Abram's concubine, and Ishmael was born. So, regardless of the ethics of all this and the cultural acceptability, this was medically reasonable, inductive OBGYN reasoning. They understood the science and they acted accordingly. But God was actually not satisfied with this. By the way, I have a little bar that says I'm screen sharing. Does that get in your way and the way it gets in my way? I'm hoping not. If so, you can't read the titles of my slides. Anyway, so God comes back and says, I will bless Sarah and will give you a son by her, and my covenant will be with him. He'll have lots of descendants. So Ishmael was not the answer. Now, God again did not rush to fulfill this promise, and Sarah either had already gone or would go through menopause, chapter 18, and then finally in chapter 21, Isaac is born. Which, all seems good, but then chapter 22, disaster strikes. God says, take your only son Isaac and sacrifice him as a burnt offering. Fortunately, we had a cameraman on site. It looked like this. Well, actually, it's a painting. But anyway, so how did Abraham reason? Well, we're not told, but we can largely reconstruct what he might have thought, because God had promised descendants through Sarah and thus through Isaac. And he had already fulfilled this remarkably when Sarah was postmenopausal, which is something that science says doesn't happen. Now, the promise of descendants obviously requires Isaac to survive. So somehow he has to survive being sacrificed. if the promise is to come true and the command is to be obeyed. So, and this episode is, of course, a paradigm for Jewish and Christian faith. For Christians, maybe there's a hint of resurrection here. Think of Hebrews 11, for example. Well, you might think, this is absurd and that's great. On the other hand, meta-inductively, one can make some sense of what Abraham might have been thinking, because after all, God's promise had already been fulfilled contrary to medicine in the birth of Isaac after menopause. So if a postmenopausal woman can have a child, maybe a dead or almost dead son can survive or come back to life and produce grandchildren somehow or other. So that kind of makes sense of what seems like an extremely unpromising situation otherwise. Another example, Moses and meta-induction. So there's the Exodus. Nowadays we have, well, I guess we have Cecil B. DeMille's movie from 60-odd years ago, or maybe have more recent cartoons if we don't know the real thing. Anyway, Moses and God rescued Israel from Egyptian slavery via miraculous plagues and parting the Red Sea, which drowned Pharaoh's army. Now, this track record, that's a good movie. People don't usually make a movie about what comes afterward. But anyway, this track record is offered as a reason to expect the fulfillment of God's further prediction of conquering the promised land of Canaan. Now, why would that be difficult? Well, Israel had non-combatants, fewer and poor weapons, and little experience, presumably, and they were attempting to conquer a land with walled cities, iron chariots, and giants. Now, I am, of course, not taking up the issue of the ethics of the conquest of Canaan, but just the inductive logic of it, which is the primary concern for the characters in the text. So Israel and the 10 spies who are following inductive military science, the sort of thing that you would encounter in Reserve Officers Training Course. Sorry, should be CORPS. Anyway, the sort of thing they teach for prospective military officers nowadays, doubted that God would enable them to conquer the promised land because, again, they were following the science. On the other hand, Joshua and Caleb think that they will be able to conquer the land if God is pleased with them. Now, we're not told how they reason, but we are told how God reasons. And we will find, I think, that it is meta-induction. So with some irritation, God asks, how long will this people despise me? How long will they not believe in me in spite of all the signs which I have wrought among them? In other words, this last line is key. It's because the point is God has this track record of throwing plagues on Egypt and defeating Pharaoh's army and so on. And that's the reason that his further predictions of conquering the land of Canaan should be believed. So it seems that God is expecting people to reason meta-inductively, and Torah faith seems to have, at least in general outline, a logic of meta-induction, such as we find in Hans Reichenbach. But this is actually not, so obviously there's a long way between the Pentateuch and Hans Reichenbach, but there is something very interesting that happens in the meantime, somewhat independently, and that is the Stoics with their defense of divination. Here I'm turning to Cicero's De Divinatione, where book 1, where he's drawing in particular on Chrysippus and Posidonius. Unfortunately, we have little, if any, of their works, but they were heads of Stoic school, and Stoics generally believed in divination, and Chrysippus and Posidonius wrote on it in defense of it a lot. So Cicero, I think, is basically what we have that survives to summarize their works. Now, Sambursky notes that given their determinism, there is a lot of similarity between scientific inference and inductive divination, although one of them makes sense to us and the other one doesn't. And I think in both cases, the point is a successful track record of divinations justifies both determinism and divination. Back to Cicero. So book 2 is by a character who is named Tully Cicero. Book 1, and it's against divination. Book 1, on the other hand, is in favor of divination. And there's controversy about which one is the real Cicero. In the last 40 years or so, maybe in sort of a postmodern sense, people have lost confidence that book 2 is the real Cicero. Book 1 is taken much more seriously. So Quintus's defense is partly inspired by Chrysippus and Posidonius, as I mentioned, and he gives example after example of ostensible fulfilled divinatory predictions as reason to expect further reliability of divination. Now, I think the most striking example would be the oracle at Delphi, where Apollo was said to give messages to the priestess who smelled the weird vapors, and then she said things that other people would interpret. That is, probably might say the most striking example in the ancient world that he would have had in mind. So this is, Quintus's reasoning, although it doesn't really look like reasoning to a lot of people, seems to be basically meta-induction. And I think it's akin to Reichenbach's entertaining clairvoyance, but this is taken seriously by Chrysippus and Posidonius, who were very serious people. So this is not hypothetical in 1938, this is real and ancient. So here's Cicero. Speaking now of natural divination, every knows the oracular, I actually can't read this because Zoom is blocking it, but anyway, that the Pythian Apollo gave to Croesus, the Athenians, and so on. I'll summarize this because you can read it if you want. The thing is, Chrysippus gives all these examples, and this track record of successful divinations is why people visit Delphi and leave expensive offerings there and did all this stuff for hundreds of years. So people wouldn't travel a long way and make huge donations if they didn't find the prophecies to be reliable, although maybe sort of petered out later on. So that basically is the meta-inductive argument that Cicero has his brother character making. Now, divination is not exactly the same as biblical prophecy. For example, it may be something very mundane, like birds flying to the left or flying to the right. But I think the logic is very similar, whether it's Jewish or pagan Greek. It seems to be meta-induction. Interestingly, you can also find this in popular or maybe not so popular movies. I don't think Imagine That did very well. But anyway, Eddie Murphy's daughter has this magic blanket that predicts successful moves in business, and he eventually comes to accept that. Or Tom Cruise's character convinces some rather hardened soldiers very quickly of his prophetic abilities, because after all, he's been through the future over and over, and they realize that. The point is, this sort of meta-inductive reasoning is something that we all intuitively do all the time, even though it's rarely been the subject of philosophical attention. Now, for the Stoics, there is no rivalry between science and divination because they had different subject matters, and that is a potential difference from the Hebrew case, where there is occasionally rivalry, but on the other hand, we are told prophecy outpredicts science in those cases. So, of course, the question is whether we should believe that these stories actually happened or not. Well, that's not something for which I need to take a position, but if you are trying to take induction seriously, or the problem of induction seriously, one thing that you shouldn't do is to sift the data, assuming the validity of induction, which in fact is what people usually do in, say, modern critical biblical scholarship, or for that matter, in modern historiography. Vincent was writing about miracles and witchcraft in the context, and he says the evidence is amazing, but we reject it because we don't think these things can happen. So that's how his history is done. But if you're taking the problem of induction seriously, that's going to be a problematic move. Okay, now I don't know how much time I have, but at this point I can turn to some ways that you might resist the conclusion that seems to be emerging.
You have around 5 to 7 minutes. Is that okay?
That's plenty for me, but if I'm preventing people from asking questions and they will want questions, then that's the 7 minutes including questions, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll be quick here. One counterattack might be Hume's contrary miracles argument. Evidence for miracles for religion A are miracles against or evidence against religion B. Well, that's true if you think that miracles prove doctrines, and Protestants used to like to say that, but it's no part of inductive logic, as John Ehrman points out. And indeed, the Protestant view was typically to reject Catholic miracles, no matter how good the testimonial evidence was. But once you have a confessional test for miracle reports, it's fairly easy for deists to come along and say they don't like any of them. They have a different confessional test, and you see this sort of thing in fact happen. Think Conyers Middleton in 1750 as a striking example of this. Compare that to, say, C.D. Broad, who would say, who was not a theist, he'd say, given the evidence, it's difficult to deny that St. Joseph of Cupertino levitated. Whatever you say about Broad, he was an empiricist. Okay, now another inductivist counterattack would be an appeal to extended track records. Gerhard Schurz would say, we should look not only at what you find claimed in the sacred scrolls, but also in physical traces. So in the history of geology, you have the old comparison of textual evidence and physical evidence, coins, monuments, stones, that sort of thing. So if the Pentateuch describes a great flood or a multitude in a desert for 40 years, we can look at the rocks, see what we find. We don't seem to find the evidence that you would expect from the sacred scrolls. And so given this broader notion of a track record, looking at the physical evidence, especially rocks as well, then maybe object level induction is vindicated after all. And I think this is a very serious point, needing further reflection. However, I do wonder that there is the assumption, that induction is to some degree assumed. Now, why would I think that? Well, prior to the Enlightenment, it was actually rather standard to ad hoc the auxiliary hypotheses. If Noah's flood didn't seem to work, then a miracle would be inferred. And this was given up by Protestants in the late 17th century. Prior to that, it was rather standard. Now, that just seems kind of implausible to us nowadays. On the other hand, Schurz tells us meta-induction uses only track records, not plausibility judgments. So given those standards, can one in fact refute that pre-Enlightenment orthodoxy, or are we maybe back with Howson's subjective Bayesianism and relativism? So I think it's kind of hard to tell, and Bertrand Russell had some related worries. So concluding, I think the problem of induction is really serious. I like what the logical empiricists said, but I don't think that it straightforwardly arrives where they wanted it to arise, or wanted it to arrive, and it may even work against them in certain ways. Because it looks like people, when exercising faith and doing things that seem implausible, were maybe kind of making sense after all. So I don't think that exceptionless induction is yet vindicated in such a way as to exclude faith in the way that people like Schurz have wanted to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have one question.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I have two questions. The first question is, why can't one adopt Quine's approach to induction so that the question about justification for induction is a non-starter, is misguided, because philosophy is part of science. Okay, so this is my first question. The second question is about the meta-justification of induction for esoteric activities like fortune telling. I think the main problem with fortune telling, etc., is not really about their accuracy or inaccuracy of prediction. It's about their unfalsifiability nature, right? So if you look at any official manual of astrology, they accumulate a lot of rules for predictions. Normally, they would not cite this until you show that their predictions is inaccurate. And then they would tell you that there is some ad hoc explanation. I think the example you cite from Genesis is a good example, right? Whether God gives the son to the couple is not important because you always have an ad hoc explanation why, right? So for many people like astrology, the problem is not about the meta-justification for induction. It's rather about their unfalsifiability. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I think in answer to Quine, I think Gerhard Schurz makes a very strong case for the need to take the problem of induction seriously. Excuse me. So I would refer you to his book, where he addresses various people who think that we don't have to worry about the problem. I don't think I have anything distinctive to say about that, but I think that he's made a very persuasive case there. So I hope that will at least be a pointer to a potential answer. Regarding fortune telling, yes. Well, I'm far from wanting to defend every particular instance of fortune telling or any sort of prophecy or the like. I mean, you can't really. I mean, there's so much of this stuff, and these things conflict. You can't really believe in all of it. But some people may have their favorite parts of it. Yeah, a lot of these things are, I take it, extremely vague, and that would be a good reason to reject them. I don't think that's true about every instance. You can find instances, for example, in the Bible, where somebody will say, if, for example, if King Ahab comes back alive, then Micaiah who predicts that he's going to die, he says, says that the Lord hasn't spoken truly through me. Or Moses somewhere says, if these men, die in the way people normally do, rather than being swallowed by the earth or some such, then then God hasn't spoken through me. So it's not the case that every instance you find in texts is unfalsifiably vague. Or maybe the prediction that Sarah would bear a son. I think if Sarah had died and never had a son, then that prediction would have been falsified. So yes, there's of course extraordinary amounts of nonsense, and then a larger realm of maybe somewhat plausible, but in fact false material in this general area. I'm far from wanting to defend the Oracle at Delphi in general, but there are cases that some people may believe and think are important, perhaps the Bible for some people, or maybe some other book. Unfalsifiability is certainly a place that many people have on many occasions taken refuge, but there can be predictions that are sufficiently specific that you could say that they hadn't, clearly say that they hadn't come true. And hence, I think in some cases you could actually make sense of the notion of a track record. Now, I think you're quite right that if they're always unfalsifiable, then it's going to be very difficult to have any notion of a track record. And there's all sorts of confirmation bias and any number of other things that one could introduce to have a misleadingly good track record. So I think in terms of fortune telling strictly considered, I expect you're right. But it's sort of a stand-in for any notion of making predictions. And if you look throughout human history, you will find some examples, I think, that are not unfalsifiably vague. And maybe there is some rational core there to find, or maybe, as Schurz would say, maybe there isn't after all, when you have a broader notion of a track record. So I hope that helps a little.